All right, Josai. Good morning, a good chodesh, everyone. Let's begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Naftali Tilson, today dedicating the share in honor of his wife's birthday. Hashem, incredible! It is the gift that keeps on giving. Baruch Hashem, beautiful for birthdays, anniversaries, Besaros Tovos for all of Am Yisrael, whatever it is. Baruch Hashem, thank you to. So first of all, Mrs. Tilson, Shemir Hashem, have a very happy birthday. Mir Hashem, Chash Baruch should give her a year filled with Mazel Bracha, Simcha Hatzlacha, and Besaros Tovos for her and her entire Mishpacha Me'er Esim Shanim Tovos. Our Talmud Torah sponsors. Last day for the month of Nisan Abba Leinu Latova. Paul Pollack, the celebration of the Nisan birthdays of his wife Kathy, granddaughter Tikva Esther, and birth of his grandson Yosef Menachem. Thank you for the sponsorship. Anonymous sponsorship in the schos of Simchas for all of our children, and for Nisan to be the month of Geula Shlema for all of Klal Yisrael. And Avram and Shane D. Kelman in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah Braina Bas Yoshua Heschel Zichron Livracha, whose yahrzeit was actually yesterday, the 29th of Nisan. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Nisham Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah shavan together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Kodesh Baruch Hu Shtei Hashem bring home all of our hostages b'shalom and b'karav, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful b'chol of Maaseh Yedehem. With that, let us begin. A tremendous thank you and a shkayach to Reb Josh Erez for giving shir yesterday. We are picking up today's daf is Chof. I actually want to pick up, Josh got a little too far for my liking over here. I go on one day and suddenly he's doing a whole daf. Ridiculous. So actually, I know that Josh got up to the last couple of lines to Meisvei. I just want to back it up just a little bit so we get the sugi in its entirety in the third wide line in. It's 2, 4, 6, 8 lines up from the bottom, same sugya. So I'm going to be asking, I'm going to be Yochanan. Meiser Sheni Meimesech Hayav and Alav. So let's remember again, the Mishnah said that if you go out and you eat Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim, ultimately, again, you get Makkos. So I asks the Gemara, so at what point exactly is there liability for Meiser Sheni? So we'll say, this is actually a fascinating Gemara, that if you would not learn the Gemara, you would actually have absolutely no idea that there is this construct just from reading the Psukim. So watch this. The Gemara says, this is Rabbi Yochanan, Mishra Pnei HaMachoma. So listen to this. There is no liability, biblical liability, for eating Meiser Sheni out of Yerushalayim, unless, of course, Meiser Sheni first has come into Yerushalayim and then has been removed. So the biblical prohibition of eating Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim only occurs if Meiser Sheni is first brought in, then taken out, and consumed outside of Yerushalayim. So Gemara says, my time, what does this mean? So Rashi says over here, look at Rashi, 6 lines up from the bottom, Mishira Pnei HaChoma. Rashi says over here, I should say, within the walls of Yerushalayim, Pnei HaChoma, V'chutz l'choma, d'masnisin, hainu da'ayle v'afke. And therefore, the Mishnah said that you get Makkos for eating Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. What that means is, you brought the Meiser Sheni in, and then you took it out, and then consumed it outside of the walls of Yerushalayim. Incredible. So the Gemara says, who would have thought, my timer, because I just want to point out, again, before you saw this Gemara, you assumed what does it mean to eat Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim? What does it mean? I separated Meiser Sheni from my produce, right? And now I have 2 choices. What are my 2 choices? Either bring the produce to Yerushalayim and eat in Yerushalayim, or redeem the produce onto money, bring the money to Yerushalayim and spend it on food in Yerushalayim. But again, the assumption, I think I understood that the prohibition of eating Meiser Sheni out of Yerushalayim is in that initial stage. I separated it out, and now again, I failed to bring it. I ate it. The Gemara says no. Rabbi Yochanan says no. That's not what happens. The only time there's a prohibition, ultimately, again, is when you bring it in, and then you bring it back out. Fascinating. My timer. What is, says the Gemara, what is the reason for this? My time, Damakra, Lifnei Hashem Elokecha Tochlenu Shana V'Shana. Pasuk says, before Hashem your God, you shall consume it. V'uksev Lo Sucha Le'echol B'Sha'arecha. The pasuk says, Meiser Sheni, you cannot eat Meiser Sheni within your gates, within your own communities. Kol Heicha Dekarinon Bei Lifnei Hashem Elokecha Tochlenu. Wherever you have a fulfillment of before Hashem you shall consume it, i.e., whenever the Meiser Sheni has already been brought in front of the Beis HaMikdash, or I should say, within the walls of Yerushalayim, Karina Bey Lo Sucha Lechol B'Sharecha. only once the Meiser Sheni has come before God, i.e. in the walls of Yerushalayim, is there a prohibition to consume the Meiser Sheni within your own confines, within your own gates. But wherever the Meiser Sheni has not been brought within the walls of Yerushalayim, lo karinan bey, lo suchal le'echol b'sharecha. We do not go ahead and say about it that you cannot eat it in the confines of your own community. The most incredible. This, I don't know, this to me might be one of the most shocking things I've encountered in my life within the last 4 minutes. This is this is overwhelming because again, it totally changes the construct of the way we think about Meiser Sheni. So again, up until this Gemara, I would have assumed prohibited consumption of Meiser Sheni means I separated out of my produce, I failed to take it to Yerushalayim, I ate it in my backyard. That's the biblical prohibition. Now Rabbi Yochanan says, no, that's not the biblical prohibition. The biblical prohibition is I brought it to Yerushalayim, then I brought it back out and consumed it outside of Yerushalayim. That's the biblical prohibition. Says the Gemara, Gemara is the Kasha, so it's a very interesting Gemara today. Rabbi Yossi says, listen to this, Kohen shall also be yodo te'ina shel tevel. So a Kohen has in his hand a fig of tevel. Tevel means, again, remember, untithed produce, so an untithed fig. So what does he do? So he says as follows, Amar, te'ina zu, trumasa bo'ukza. So let the truma portion be on the ukitz, on the stem part. This means towards the bottom of the fig. Now, he's doing something over here. We've seen this concept before about designating meiser designate trumas and meisers without actively separating them. So he's saying let the truma be on the bottom stem part of the fruit. Okay, meiser rishon b'tzvona. So let the meiser rishon portion be in the northern part of the fruit. Meiser Sheni the droma. Meiser Sheni be in the southern part of the fruit. V'hishnas Meiser Sheni v'hu b'Yushalayim. And let's say, for example, we're dealing with, remember, different tides apply different times, different years of the Shemitah cycle. So let's say, for example, in this case over here, it was a Meiser Sheni year. And let's say the Kohen was in Yerushalayim. Or over Meiser Ani, or it's a Meiser Ani year, v'hu b'Gvulin. And ultimately, again, he's outside of Yerushalayim. So remember, again, you never have Meiser Sheni and Meiser Ani the same years. They alternate. So for our purposes of our example, let's just go that it was a Meiser Sheni year. So all of this is happening inside of Yerushalayim. So again, Kohen is standing with his fig, and essentially he designates all the different Shumas and Meisers while staying in Yerushalayim. And it is a Meiser Sheni year. Okay. So what's the halacha? Ochla. Now he ate it. So what is halacha? If he ate a top of chaf, ochla. So loke achos, he gets one set of malchus. They both say, interestingly enough, even though he did everything, there was one tithe that was not separated, which was Trumas Meiser. Trumas Meiser. So because Trumas Meiser was not designated, therefore he'll get malchus for consumption of Trumas Meiser. Okay, v'zar sha'achla, but if a non-Kohen ate the same fig, loke shtayim, ultimately again, he'll go, so we'll say, so just understand, what is he getting? What is the Kohen getting malchus on? Because the fig still has the status of tevel. Remember, the status of tevel is only removed if all tithes are removed. Right? If you have one tithe left untithed, unremoved, so then the produce itself is still titled or is still designated as tevel. So therefore, the Kohen in this case was an excellent effort. He got almost everything, but because Trumas Meiser wasn't separated, therefore again he will get malchus, one set of malchus for consuming tevel. If a non-Kohen ate it, the non-Kohen will get two sets of malchus. Why two sets of malchus? Number one, tevel. Number two, truma. Right? He is consuming truma, which of course is prohibited. Rashi says over here, not yet. So the Gemara says, Shilu b'tchila achla ina loke ela achas. Interestingly enough, what's fascinating about this case is, had the Kohen not designated anything, or had anything not been designated, there would have only been one set of malchus for tevel. Right? So it's fascinating. In other words, that the Kohen went ahead and designated all of these things, failed to take care of Trumas Meiser, so therefore it still has the status of tevel, but at the same time there also has been a Truma designation. So now when a non-Kohen consumes it, he's going to get two sets of malchus, one for tevel and one for Truma. Had the Kohen not done any designations and the non-Kohen consumed it, he would have only gotten one set of Makkos for Tevel. Okay, so we'll say, so now remember, what we're focused on over here is the Meiser Sheni piece. Remember again, what did the Gemara say? The Gemara said the Kohen is going ahead, standing in Yerushalayim with this fig, right? And he's designating Meiser Sheni. Okay, so now Taima, the Iseh Yerushalayim. So interestingly enough, the reason why now when he goes in and consumes it, that he's not chayiv is because he's standing in Yerushalayim. Habigvulin, interestingly enough, had he gone ahead and taken this fig out of Yerushalayim and then consumed it, lo keshalosh. Ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa would have gotten 3 sets of malchus, one for consumption of Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. The afa gav delav roe pnei choma. So first, I'll take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says hachi garsinon. You see that it's like a divrei hamaskel in the middle of Rashi. It's almost right across in the Gemara. Time of the Meiser Sheni Yerushalayim Meiser Sheni bigvulin ha Meiser Sheni bigvulin loke shalosh. So also what you see over here is as follows. The reason why in this case over here there's only 2 sets of malchus and not 3 sets of malchus is because for Meiser Sheni he's consuming it in Yerushalayim. The inference from this would have been, had it been a Meiser Sheni year, and all of this was happening outside of Yerushalayim, there would have been 3 sets of Malkus. Right? Why 3 sets of Malkus? Let's go with the Zar. Let's go with the non-Kohen. Right? Number 1 for Tevel, number 2 for Truma, and number 3 for Meiser Sheni out of Yerushalayim. What do you see from here? That there is a biblical prohibition for Meiser Sheni, even if the Meiser Sheni never came into Yerushalayim. That's the raya. So this is a steer, this is a contradiction to Rabbi. Remember again, Rabbi Yochanan said the only time you are liable the only time you're biblically liable for consumption of Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim is if it was brought into the walls and then taken out. What we're inferring from this case over here is the case that the way the Gemara set it up is the guy is eating the fig in Yerushalayim on a Meiser Sheni year. That's why he's not getting Malchus for that. He'll only get Malchus and non-Kohen. The Zar will get Malchus for Tevel and for Truma. But the inference from this is, if this whole thing was taking place out of Yerushalayim, he would have gotten 3 sets of Malchus. 1 for Tevel, 1 for Truma, and 1 for Meiser Sheni, even though the Meiser Sheni never came within the walls of Yerushalayim. What do you see from here? You get Malchus for Meiser Sheni consumption, even if Meiser Sheni never came within the walls. Contradicts Rabbi Yochanan. To which the Gemara says, no, da'iliva afke, maybe not. But we're talking about a case where the Meiser Sheni, the fig was brought in and taken out. Okay, to which the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, ihachi, ma'ila memra, then what's the chiddush? What's the chiddush? Hachama askinon, this is very interesting, this is fascinating. Hachama askinon, kigon da'ailinhu bitivlaihu. No, the case over here, this is quite fascinating. The case over here is the fig was brought in. But the fig was brought in the produce was brought in a tevel state. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi is just a little bit further down still in the short lines. The Ivy Bitivle, Lahi Te'ina B'Yushalayim, they call Tua Mechitzos L'Meiser Sheni Ha'asid Litram Mimeno. So I will say this is quite riveting. The Gemara wants to suggest the following: that the case over here is where the fig was initially brought into Yerushalayim. Now, when it was brought into Yerushalayim, it was brought in as Tevel. The Gemara wants to suggest that perhaps the way halacha views tithing is, we look at tithes that will be designated, even if they have not yet actively been designated. What does this mean? That when I bring a fig into Yerushalayim, the halacha recognizes that at some point in the future, part of this fig is going to be designated as Meiser Sheni. So we view that Meiser Sheni designation as existing already now at the time the fig was brought in, even though what? It was not actively designated. We view it as if it was designated, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, this is considered to be Meiser Sheni that was within the walls and then taken out. And therefore, again, in our case over here, if one was to subsequently eat this fig outside of Yerushalayim, there would actually be liability for the Meiser Sheni. Incredible. The Gemara says, "Bekasavar matnos shelo hormu kamisha hormu damyon." That even tithing designations that have not actively been designated are halachically viewed as if they were designated. So I will say, I just want to point out how profound this is. So what this means, just to understand what this means, is that halacha l'maisa, if you take we'll just use the fig because that's the Gemara's example. You take a fig, a tevel fig, into Yerushalayim, right? So now what the Gemara is suggesting over here is, since we know that you're going to have to separate out Meiser Sheni from that fig, even though you have not done so now, we view that fig as already having a Meiser Sheni designation, so that when you bring it into Yerushalayim, that Meiser Sheni has been within the walls of Yerushalayim. Therefore, if you take it back out, or when you take it back out, if you were to eat it, there would be biblical liability for that. Even though, again, at the time you brought the fig in, there was no active designation, but since there will be a designation, we view it as if the matana has actively been designated already. Fantastic. Mar says, 1 second, is that true? Does Rabbi Yossi really hold that way? After all, what about the following case? Vatanya. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, Mishum Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says, Rabbi Yossi, here we go. Listen to this. So Beishan Beis do not argue in the following case. In other words, they agree in the following case of Peros Shelo Nigmaru Malachtan, fruits that are not yet fully processed. The simplest example would be of this, unripened fruit. That's the easiest way to look at this. Unripened produce or unripened grain, or just grain that has not, let's say, been what's it called? Husked. Okay, yeah, unprocessed, or whatever it is, right? Unprocessed, right? So whether it's produce, whether it's whatever it might be, it's not fully finished. So watch this. Let's say I bring in unripened produce into Yerushalayim. Everyone agrees that when I bring that produce back out of Yerushalayim, what could I do? I can go ahead and redeem my Meiser Sheni onto money, and go ahead and bring the money to Yerushalayim. I both say, just use something. There's a different halacha, Meiser Sheni. We actually saw this reference before as well. The halacha is like this: if I live out of Yerushalayim, and I have Baruch Hashem a lot of produce, I have Meiser Sheni. What am I allowed to do? I can redeem the Meiser Sheni onto money, bring the money to Yerushalayim, use the money to buy food. However, if you bring produce to Yerushalayim, once that produce enters into the city, you are no longer allowed to redeem it onto money. That's the halacha. We're going to touch on that, about where that halacha is from in just a little bit. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But again, with the Gemara saying like this, everyone agrees, if you bring in unprocessed produce into Yerushalayim, and then let's say take it out, you could still redeem the Meiser Sheni onto money. Now, what's the logic behind that? It makes a lot of sense. Why? Because since it's not fully processed, since it's not complete, it's not subject to Meiser Sheni. So because it's not subject to Meiser Sheni, therefore, again, there's no problem with you redeeming it even after you take it out. Listen to this. So what's the machlokes? Aman nechlaku. What's the machlokes about? Aperos shenigmara malachtan v'avir Yerushalayim. Let's say you bring in fully processed produce into Yerushalayim. So now, again, I'm bringing in a basket of fully processed produce. So now, what is the halacha? Shevei Shammai omrim yachzer ma'aser sheni shalom v'yochlem Yerushalayim. So Beis Shammai says that halacha l'maisa, right? The produce ma'aser sheni must be consumed in Yerushalayim. Once that produce has been brought into Yerushalayim, you cannot take the Meiser Sheni out and consume it anywhere else. Beis Hillel says, Yifteh v'yochal b'chol makom. Beis Hillel says, no, not true. Since the Meiser Sheni wasn't actively designated, therefore, halacha l'maisa, you could remove the produce from Yerushalayim, still redeem the produce onto money, and bring the money to Yerushalayim afterwards. So we'll say, so now, what's the machlokes over here? So Bepashtos, what it sounds like is as follows. Beis Shammai holds, matanos shelo hormu can be hormu damyan. Beis Shammai holds that when you bring in fully processed produce into Yerushalayim, we view those tithes as actively being designated. Now remember again, the only tithe entry into Yerushalayim matters for is what? Is Meiser Sheni, right? That's the only one that it really matters for. But according to Beis Shammai, when you bring fully processed produce into Yerushalayim, we view the Meiser Sheni as if it has been designated. Because it's been designated, it's been within the Choma. Once it's been within the Choma, there's two things that happen. Number one, there's a biblical prohibition to consume it outside of Yerushalayim, and you are no longer allowed to redeem that Meiser Sheni onto money. But Beis Hillel disagrees with this. Beis Hillel says no. Beis Hillel says not true. Meiser Sheni is only designated when when Meiser Sheni is designated, right? There's no such thing as Meiser Sheni being designated until there has been an active designation of a Meiser Sheni portion within the produce itself. Incredible. And if you think it's true that everyone agrees that Meiser Sheni designation is as if it's been made, even though it has not been actively designated. So the Gemara says, "Hakal to a mechitzos." So again, the mechitzos, the walls of Yerushalayim have absorbed this produce. If that's the case, how does Beis Hillel allow for the subsequent redemption of that Meiser Sheni onto money? Amar Rabba says, no. Mechitza le'achol da'araisa, mechitza liklot drabanan. So this is very interesting actually. So Rabba says really there's two different halachas going on over here. There's a halacha that once produce enters into Yerushalayim, so Meiser Sheni can no longer be consumed outside of Yerushalayim. That is a din da'araisa. That's a din da'araisa. The idea that once Meiser Sheni comes into Yerushalayim, it can no longer be redeemed onto money, that's a din d'Rabbanan. Fascinating. That's a din d'Rabbanan. Okay, and therefore again, Rabba wants to be mechalek ultimately again between those two separate halachas. The Gemara says, "V'chi gazer Rabbanan," and when are the Rabbanan goes there? So the Gemara says, "Ki isa be'enei." Only when halacha l'maisa, the Meiser Sheni itself is actively designated. However, the Gemara says, "Ki isi be'enei." "V'chi gazer Rabbanan ki isi be'enei betivlei lo gazer Rabbanan." However, again, when the produce itself is still tavel, ultimately again the Rabbanan not goes there. And that's how you could explain Beis Hillel's position. So Beis Hillel is agreeing. Beis Hillel could technically agree that even matanos shelo hormu kamisha hormu damyon, that even though you have not yet actively separated Meiser Sheni, it's as if it's been separated, and therefore halacha l'maisa, once that produce enters into Yerushalayim, you can no longer consume that Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim, but you are still allowed to redeem it onto money. Why? Because the concept that being within the choma prevents redemption, that's the Rabbanan. And the Rabbanan only goes around that in a case where the Meiser Sheni itself is extant. But if the Meiser Sheni has not been designated, then the rabbinic prohibition or the rabbinic obligation does not apply. Fascinating. So Ravina gives a different approach. Kigon dinakit le bekanya. So also it's interesting. Ravina says, no. What's the case? The case over here is where I'm carrying my Meiser Sheni, and how am I carrying it? What says yesterday's daf? How am I carrying it? On a stick like they had, like in the, like the cartoons, like you used to, right? So you had like a stick, and you had like a little packle tied on the end of the stick. Right? And what happens, remember again, I walk into Yerushalayim, and again, but my packle is outside of Yerushalayim. My packle is outside of Yerushalayim. So both say, remember the Gemara says, Ravina says, what's the halacha in that case? The halacha is since your person entered into Yerushalayim, is considered to be as if what? As if your Meiser Sheni entered into Yerushalayim as well. Okay, fascinating. The Gemara says, by the way, once we do that, the tifshot bayid rapapa. This will answer the question of Rav Papa, because Rav Papa Mamish had this exact question, right? What happens if the person enters into Yerushalayim, but the packle that he's holding ultimately, again, remains outside of Yerushalayim? So now we see what's the halacha. When you enter Yerushalayim, your packle enters Yerushalayim with you as well. Absolutely incredible. So we'll say, by the way, just so you appreciate what beautiful, just metaphorical significance that has. Hey, in general, as we go through life, all of us carry a packle, right? We all have a lot of stuff or some of us have a lot of, right? Everyone in life carries baggage. Some people just have a carry-on. Some people have to hire a porter, with those big things, like to schlep all the stuff, but we all have it. But the interesting part about people and their baggage is that we often try not to deal with it. Right? We often try not to deal with it. The imagery of kind of carrying your packle, not in your arms, but on a stick extended behind you, I think often is metaphorical for people not really wanting to have to deal with their baggage. So I keep it a little bit at a distance. So I'll say, what's beautiful over here? What does the Gemara seem to resolve? The Gemara says, so the whole shaila is, if you enter into Yerushalayim and your body's in Yerushalayim, does your packle come with you? Does your packle come with you? So now it seems to be that Allah Chalamayis, the Gemara is suggesting that once your person enters into Yerushalayim, your packle comes with you as well, which also gives us, I think, beautiful anticipatory excitement for the future. The day will come when we will all enter Yerushalayim. The day will come. The Shir Malos B'Shuva Shemesh Shiva Sion. The day will come. And what's the most beautiful part about Mashiach? What's the most beautiful part about entering Yerushalayim? Is that Mashiach doesn't just take care of your body. Geula doesn't just take care of your guf. But Emir Hashem, all the baggage comes with you also. and whatever the baggage there is, whatever difficulties there are, whatever challenges there are as well, once you enter into Yerushalayim and Mirat Hashem, all the peklach come along with you. And just as you are uplifted upon entering into Yerushalayim, all of that baggage gets dealt with as well. Another reason to daven for Mashiach, another reason to yearn for Geula. So let's get back to the halacha of Maisa. So how do we pass it over here? Because this is big stuff, right? So first of all, in general, do we accept this precept about Meiser Sheni? So first of all, the Rambam paskins in Hilchos Meiser Sheni, Perek Beis halacha Vav. So the Rambam says very interesting. He says, Ein Elokim min haTorah ad sheyochlanu ad shenichnas. I'm sorry. So it says, first of all, this is how we paskin. We paskin halacha l'maisa. There is no biblical prohibition for meiser sheni consumption, unless, of course, meiser sheni came into Yerushalayim first and was then removed. So this, I'll tell you the truth, like this undoes everything we've known in Shas up until this point. We always thought that the way it works in Meiser Sheni, I'm a farmer, I designated Meiser Sheni, I have one of two choices. Bring the produce to Yerushalayim, redeem it onto money, bring the money to Yerushalayim, spend it on food. But if I eat that produce outside of Yerushalayim, that is an Issur D'Oraisa. That is false. That is false. The way passing is that halacha l'maisa, again, there is only biblical prohibition if the Meiser Sheni was brought in and then ultimately taken out. Now, there is an Issur D'Rabbanan to consume Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim, even if it has never come within the walls. So that's halacha l'maisa number one. So halacha l'maisa number one. What about matano shelo hormu kamisho hormu damyon? So ultimately, again, the Rambam paskins this way. It says Meiser Sheni shenichnas Yerushalayim afilu shad ma'asal tzim misham shekvar kaltom mechitzos. V'chein peres al kal mekesef Meiser Yod aver v'otzino shiyatzu b'shkaga yaksu v'yochel Yerushalayim uklitas mechitzos midivreihem afilu Meiser Sheni mechumsha. So both say, so the way we paskin halacha l'maisa also, the Rambam says, is that the walls absorb Meiser Sheni midrabanon. So therefore, again, once you bring in Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim, you are no longer, let's say you bring in produce, you are no longer allowed to redeem that produce onto money. That we paskin that way, but that is a din d'Rabbanan. Mid-D'Oraisa, you're still permitted to redeem it onto money. Okay, incredible. All right, we'll say brand new sugya, and this is a fantastic sugya, the Maisa sugya. So here we go. HaKoreach karcha barosho, Mishnah. Person creates, literally again, a bald spot on his head. Now, why is someone doing this? So Rashi points out over here, second white line in Rashi, HaKoreach karcha barosho al hames. Now, remember again, the Torah, we're going to see there are two prohibitions for this. One for Zorim, non-Kohanim, one for Kohanim. The idea of lo yikrchu karcha, of not making a bald spot on the head, this was a mourning practice. People would go out and lacerate themselves, pull out hair from their head out of a mourning practice. So again, and that's very important because the biblical prohibition only occurs if one does this in the context of mourning. So again, akoreach karcha barosho, one who creates a bald spot in his head, pulls out his hair over mourning for the dead, v'makif pa'as rosho, shaving off your payas. Shaving off your payas. So this, literally again, the way that it's framed is rounding off the corners of your head. V'amashchis pa'as zekano, or one who destroys literally again the corners of his beard. We're going to see, this refers to shaving with a razor. Now again, I want to point out over here, these are different prohibitions. Koreach karcha barosho was dafka a mourning practice, right? Shaving off your payas, makif pa'as rosho, going ahead and rounding off the corners of your head, that has nothing to do with mourning. Nothing to do with mourning, okay? Or mashches pa'asakano, destroying the corners of your beard, also nothing to do with mourning. Sorit svita achas alames. This is back now to mourning practices, or one who lacerates himself as a display of mourning for the dead. Chayiv. Ultimately, again, one is chayiv for this. Sarat svita achas al chamisha mesim, o chamish svitos al mesecha. This is very interesting. So let's say a person went ahead and lacerated himself. One laceration over 5 people who died, or 5 lacerations over 1 person who died. What's the halacha? Chayiv akalachas va'achas. One is chayiv for every laceration. Again, more about that in the Gemara. Al rosh shtayim achas mikan va'achas mikan. In general, for rounding out the corners of your head, there's 2 pockets of liability. Rashi points out over here the head essentially is divided into 2, right? So essentially, and again, we'll get into this more specifically, it's talking about shaving off of the payas. of the payas. So there's two distinct prohibitions, one for each paya, one for each corner of the head. Allah zakan, for the beard, shtayim mikan mikan va'achas milamata. As we will see, and we'll see all of this on the beard. There's essentially 5 areas of liability. One is by the temple, right? So what 2 temples on each side. The other is by the jawbone, where the jawbone protrudes, and so that's 2, 4, and then the 5th is the chin. The 5th is the chin. So again, those are the areas where if one quote unquote destroys the hair on those areas, there is biblical prohibition. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, im nitlu kulan ka'achas eno chayiv ala achas. That's interesting. Rabbi Eliezer says, and we'll see this in Gemara, if somehow you were to go ahead and, let's say, destroy the hair in all 5 places at once, halacha l'maisa, you would only be chayiv once. Ve'eno chayiv ad sheitlana betar. And this prohibition of destroying the hair, whether it's the payas, right, or ultimately again on the beard, is with a razor. Rabbi Eliezer Omer afilu laktu b'malakei t'bereitani chayiv. So Rabbi Eliezer says, even if you went ahead and you cut off the hair with like some type of planing instrument, right, something that you would use to plane down wood, which sounds excessively painful, right? But if you were to do that, right, with that type of instrument, halacha l'maisa, that would be the biblical prohibition as well. Incredible. All right, Rabbi says that's the Mishnah. There's certainly a lot to unpack over here. So Gemara, Tan Rabbanan, lo yikirchu karcha. So the Torah says you shall not go ahead. Rabbi says, let me just point this out to you. There's 2 psukim over here. The pasuk that the Gemara is quoting is a pasuk by Kohanim. Lo yikirchu karcha berosham. Do not make a bald spot on your head. Upaas zikanam lo yigalechu. Do not go ahead and shave the corners of your beard. Ubivsaram lo yisratu saratas. And do not make a laceration on your body. That's by Kohanim. Now, what's the pasuk by Gans Klal Yisrael? Bari matam Hashem elokechem. This is Hashem now talking to the rest of the nation. You are children to Hashem your God. Lo tisgodedu. So again, we'll see what lo tisgodedu means, but ultimately, again, do not make a bald spot between your eyes over the dead. So same prohibition mentioned by Yisrael and by Kohanim. So now here we go. Says the Gemara, lo yikerchu. Now the pasuk by Kohanim says, do not make a bald spot. So the Gemara says, Yachal afilu karach arba v'chamesh krichos. Lo yechayv ala achos. I'm going to thought that even if you make 4 or 5 bald spots, you only chayiv once. Chayiv once. Tabalomar karcha. Therefore, the pasuk says karcha on the singular to teach you what? Lechayiv al kol karcha v'karcha. Every bald spot that you make out of mourning for the dead ultimately generates liability. Berosham, on your head. Matam. Why does it have to say berosham? So the Gemara says, Lefi shene'emar lo tisgodedu v'lo tasimu karcha b'neinechem lameis. Since the pasuk says lo tisgodedu, and do not go ahead and make a bald spot between your eyes for the dead. Yachal lo yechayev el al b'neinayim bilvad. I might have thought that there's only liability if I literally do it between my eyes. The Gemara says, Minayim, the Rabbos kalarosh. How do I know that there's liability for creating this bald spot anywhere on the head? Talmud lomar berosham. Therefore, the pasuk says on their head, l'rabos kalarosh. Anywhere on the head, there's liability. I ve'emni ela bekohanim shariba bahen hakasam esasiros. Now again, I only know that it's by kohanim because I would think maybe kohanim again in general have a lot of additional mitzvahs. That's where there's liability. To which the Gemara says Yisrael minayin. How do I know about Yisrael? Nemar kan karcha v'nemar la'alan karcha. It says karcha over here and it says karcha over there. Just like over there, you're chayiv on every bald spot. The chayiv ala rosh kebenayinayim, and a chayiv on the head, just like by between the eyes. Afkan chayiv al kol karcha v'karcha v'chayiv ala rosh kebenayinayim. Beautiful. Okay. And I will say, as we said before, the interesting idea about a karcha, about creating a bald spot, is the biblical prohibition is only if it's associated with a mourning practice. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "Hani dalid v'heikri chosechidam." So for good, so that's what I have. So first of all, essentially we're making gzeir shava between the pasuk by the Kohanim and the pasuk by Yisrael, and we comes out with 2 halachas. Number one is obligated for pulling out hair anywhere on the head. It's just, we'll say, Beinayinayim, obviously, once you're talking about they would pull out like eyebrows. They pull out eyebrows, ultimately, again, also as a display of mourning. So I'm chayiv for causing a karcha anywhere on the head. But again, and every karcha is its own biblical prohibition. But there's only liability if it's done in mourning practice for the dead. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Hani dalad v'hei kri chosei chidami. So if you remember again, The Mishnah brought down an interesting case, right? The Mishnah made a case ultimately again that if a person goes ahead and does 4 or 5 krichos, right? Goes ahead and does 5 bald spots at once. You can only be chayiv. You could technically be chayiv once. So what's the case over here? Hani dalad v'hei krichos hechi dami. What's the case of 4 or 5 bald spots? So if again I'm making 4 or 5 bald spots successively, right, and each of them has their own hasra, then pshita. Then obviously there's going to be individual liability for each of those. Ella, listen to this. So what we're looking for the case is 4 or 5 bald spots for which there would be individual liability. So what's the case? What's the case? If you're talking about I do bald spot 1, right? Hasra, bald spot 1. Hasra, bald spot 2. Hasra. So obviously there's going to be individuated liability for those things. So again, if halacha l'maisa, Ella, the Gemara wants to say bechad hasra. If it's 1 hasra, right? 1 asra, and then I make 4 or 5 bald spots, I should only be chayiv once. Why? The Gemara compares this to an interesting case. Mi mechayiv, would you be chayiv individually? But now we listen to this. Nazir shahaya shose yayin kolayom. Sometimes when you fall big, right? So the Nazir, he's not just making a l'chaim, like he's all in. He's all in, right? So he's drinking wine the entire day. So Rabbi says, so what's talacha? Eino chayiv ela achos. He's only going to be chayiv once. Only going to be chayiv once. So the Gemara says, however, amrulo al tishta. But if they kept giving him individual hasras before every cup, Nazir, don't drink this. Nazir, don't drink this. V'hu shoseh chayiv al kol achas v'achos. Then it'll be chayiv once. So we'll say, what do you see from here? 1 hasra before multiple repeated acts only yields 1 liability. Multiple hasras before multiple acts yields individual liability. So what's the case of 4 or 5 bald spots? So the Gemara says, listen to this. Lo tzricha tisach chamish etzba'osav nasha va'osvinu bebas achas. This is fascinating. We'll say, what's the case? The case where the guy took nasha. Rashi points out over here, nasha, perush, sam shemeshir es haseir, v'asach mimenu eno tzomeach seir begufo. So what happens? The case over here is he takes a cream, a hair removal cream. He puts hair removal cream on 5 fingers. And what does he do? He applies the 5 fingers to his head all at once. So 5 individual acts, but done simultaneously. This could be a case where halacha l'maisa, there could be 5 individual liabilities. The havile hasra l'chol chad v'chad. Ultimately, again, the hasra could count for each and every act. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, "V'osinu b'vasachos," almost right across. "V'osinu b'vasachos behema komos." So again, we'll call right. The guy takes the cream on 5 fingers, puts the cream on his head, or puts his fingers on his head at once. So Rashi says, "Behek komos." Dahavile hey krichos ubechad hasra. And there's 1 hasra over here. The chayvin de bebas achos ka'avid my chazes the chayil hasra hai etzba. So it's very interesting. So essentially, over here, that 1 hasra that he's given before the 5 acts, that 1 hasra devolves upon each of the acts, because they are 5 separate bald spots. So 1 hasra working to devolve upon 5 individual acts, yielding 5 individual instances of liability. Riveting. Okay. So now Gemara says, by the way, v'kama shir karcha. How much is a bald spot? Rav Huna Amar, Kedei Sheira Merosho. Rav Huna says, you pull out enough hair that you can see your scalp. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan Mishum, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, Kegris, the size of a gris. Okay, which I will say is the size of a small lentil. Ke Tanoi, Kamashik Gris, Achirim, others say, Kedei Sheira Merosho. Okay, so we'll say, so the Gemara suggests Machlokes Tanoim. Some say it's a gris, some say it's enough to see the scalp. Amar Rav Yehuda, Bar Chaviva, Pligi Bat Plasa Tanoi. Machlokes Tanoim. Chad Omer Kegris. One says the size of this small lentil. The Chad Omer Kedei Shira Merosho. Other says this to be able to see the scalp. The Chad Omer Kishtei Sa'aros. And one says like 2 hairs. 2 hairs, that's a bald spot. V'ike demafik shtei Sa'aros. Uma'ayel b'chad asha. And one removes, says no, there's no position that says 2 hairs, and instead inserts in there the size of a lentil. This simanach, and the way to remember this is Baheres Kegris Umichi Bechadasha. All right, so I'll say, so this is a way to remember it through the laws of tsaras. I don't know. I've never met anyone that used a mnemonic from tsaras to remember anything. Okay, but I guess by the times of the Gemara it's worked, right? A baharis, which is a problematic discoloration, is the size of a gris. And a michya, which is a healed burn, which is not tameis kadash. Okay, so as I said, the idea of it, sumachlokes, how much is a bald spot? Fundamental machlokes. So Tana, hanota, so both says it's very interesting. Hanota male piazog b'shabes chayiv. Interesting, I must say, halacha l'maisa, if you go ahead and you remove a scissors worth of hair on Shabbos, you are chayiv. Now, what are you chayiv for? You're chayiv for gozes, right? One of the 39 malachos is gozes. Gozes means shearing. Shearing is the act of removing any type of hair from the place where it grows. So, of course, the paradigmatic example of this was the removal of wool from the sheep in order to create the yerios, the curtains of the Mishkan, right? But again, the application of this could be a person pulling out hair from his head on Shabbos. So halacha l'maisa again. Now, technically, if you were to pluck out hair, that would not be a din d'oraisa, that'd be a dirabanan, right? Because the way that hair removal gozes would have been done with a kli, with a utensil. Okay, so then the Gemara says, Tana, hanol tamali piazog b'Shabbos chayiv. If you remove a scissors worth of hair on Shabbos, that is biblical liability. How much is a scissors worth? Rabbi Yehuda, shtayim, 2 hairs. But we learned elsewhere that for a bald spot it's 2 hairs. You're right. The ema, the chen lekarcha shtayim. Say just like by Shabbos, the shear of prohibition is 2 hairs. So too again for a bald spot, for karcha, it's 2 hairs as well. That supports this. If one removes a scissors worth of hair on Shabbos, you're chayiv. How much is a scissors worth? Shtayim. So we'll say, good. So Shabbos over here also. You move 2 scissors worth of hair, you're liable for that. Rabbi Lezer, achos, this is very interesting. Rabbi Lezer says, even the removal of 1 hair. They will say, that's pretty wild, right? Now again, what's the concept of removal of 2 hairs? Remember, for Hilchos Shabbos, in order to be in violation of a malacha, you have to do something of substance. It has to be something substantive. So at least most basic unit of substantive-kite has to be reached. So again, therefore the first opinion says 2 hairs. Rabbi Elazar says even 1 hair. You must listen to this. Now, normally the Chacham will say, no, the only time you're chayiv on Shabbos is if you remove 2 hairs, with one exception. If a person is dafka removing white hairs, right? So if you're removing white hairs, even the removal of 1 white hair will be a malacha because that is a significant act. Afilu achos shu chayiv. Now, both say, now, why is that? Because remember, again, that's called malachas machshavas. Normally, the removal of 1 hair is insignificant. But again, when one is actively weeding out white hairs, then again, even the removal of 1 hair is considered to be a significant act, and therefore there would be Shabbos liability for that as well. The Gemara says, by the way, v'davar za'afilu b'chol aser. For a man, removing of white hairs is going to be biblically prohibited even during the week. Why? Mishum shenemar lo yilbash gever simlas isha. Because the pasuk says a man is not permitted to wear a woman's clothing. Now, this prohibition of cross-dressing, right, this prohibition of wearing women's clothing doesn't just refer to clothing, but it refers to the fact that a man is not permitted to engage in any practice that is uniquely feminine. This would refer to, let's say, shaving hair on certain parts of the body that men don't normally do, that women might do, right? Or, for that matter, pulling out white hairs, which is considered to be an act that women do or men didn't do, or by extension, by the way, coloring hair, right? Coloring hair, which is a practice, a feminine practice. Again, an interesting discussion in the poskim about whether or not there's a biblical prohibition for men to engage in that as well. Different discussion, but the point over here, the Gemara seems to clearly say that halacha l'maisu, removal of a white hair, is a feminine practice, and therefore, again, a man cannot do it. So interestingly enough, on Shabbos is going to be prohibited because halacha l'maisa, the removal of 1 white hair, in other words, is significant. But even during the week, it will be prohibited ultimately als simlas isha. I to both say, shkoyach. Shem milestone, finishing the parak. Shech, the new parak, and more tomorrow. Excellent. A lot of good halacha l'maisa ahead of us as well. All right, to us, have a wonderful day. Good chodesh, everyone.